The sand of the Colosseum floor is already dark with blood when they drag her out at noon. Her name is Aurelia Tertia, and she is 23 years old, a freedwoman accused of poisoning her former master's wife. Though she has maintained her innocence through 3 days of preliminary torture that have left her unable to walk without assistance. The guards who hold her arms are not gentle. They do not need to be. The 50,000 Romans filling the seats above are finishing their midday meals, chatting with neighbors, barely glancing at the arena floor where the morning's animal hunts have concluded, and the afternoon's gladiatorial matches have not yet begun. This hour belongs to the condemned. Aurelia can feel the heat of the sand through the thin shift they have left her, her only garment, already torn from the handling. She can smell the blood and offal from the morning's kills, can hear the casual conversation of spectators who have seen this so many times it no longer holds their full attention. She can see the other condemned being led out behind her, 7 men and 3 women, all scheduled to die in the next hour, through methods designed not merely to kill, but to entertain. She does not yet know which method has been assigned to her. The magistrates who sentenced her did not specify. The arena officials who processed her this morning did not tell her. She will learn what is about to happen to her body only when it begins happening. The arena master, a heavyset man named Decimus Valerius Festus, who has supervised these noon executions for 11 years, consults his wax tablet and gestures toward Aurelia. 2 attendants approach carrying something that glints in the Mediterranean sun. It takes her a moment to understand what she is seeing. A garment made of linen that has been soaked in pitch and oil, designed to be placed over her body and then ignited. The tunica molesta, the troublesome shirt. She has heard of this punishment. Everyone in Rome has heard of it. But hearing about fire and feeling it approach your skin are different things entirely. What happens next in that arena, and what happened to thousands of other condemned prisoners across 4 centuries of Roman entertainment, is what tonight's video will reveal in detail that no classroom ever taught you. What you are about to learn has been sanitized out of most historical education because the reality is too disturbing for general audiences. You know that Romans watched gladiators fight. You have seen the movies, the heroic combat, the dramatic thumbs up or thumbs down, the noble deaths of warriors who chose to fight. That version of Roman entertainment is real, but radically incomplete. The gladiatorial matches were the main event. But before the main event came the executions, the systematic killing of condemned prisoners, using methods designed to maximize both suffering and spectacle. These executions were not hidden, shameful necessities. They were entertainment. They were scheduled. They were advertised. They were popular. Tonight you will learn about 13 specific methods the Romans used to execute prisoners in the arena. Methods that went far beyond simple killing into territory that modern forensic psychologists classify as ritualized. Torture murder with mass participation. You will learn about the tunica molesta, the burning garment that transformed condemned prisoners into living torches while crowds watched and cheered. You will learn about the damnatio ad bestias, the condemnation to beasts that was not simply being thrown to lions, but an elaborate production involving dozens of animal species and staging designed to prolong death. You will learn about the ludi meridiani, the noon executions where prisoners were forced to kill each other in combat with no armor and no possibility of survival. You will learn about the mythological executions, the theatrical productions where condemned prisoners were forced to act out fatal myths, actually dying as Icarus fell from artificial wings, actually being torn apart as Orpheus was dismembered by Maenads, actually being violated as Pasiphae was mounted by the bull. Subscribe if you want to understand what Roman civilization actually looked like behind the marble facades and philosophical treatises. Comment below, telling me where in the world you are watching from. Because Aurelia is standing in that arena with the pitch-soaked garment approaching her body, And I am going to tell you exactly what happened next, and what happened to thousands of others who died, in ways that the Roman crowds considered appropriate entertainment for a afternoon at the games. Let us begin with the flames. The burning garment was not a quick death. It was designed to be slow, to be visible, to be theatrical in ways that satisfied audiences who had grown sophisticated in their tastes for suffering. The tunic itself was constructed from cheap linen, the kind used for slaves' clothing, soaked thoroughly in pitch, resin, and animal fat. When ignited, this combination burned slowly rather than flash combusting, producing flames that consumed the victim over a period of 10 to 15 minutes rather than killing through shock within seconds. The condemned prisoner was dressed in the tunic while it was still unlit, pulled over the head, tied at the waist to prevent removal, sometimes secured at wrists and ankles to posts that would hold the victim upright as the flames did their work. The ignition was itself theatrical. Attendants approached with torches from multiple directions, lighting the garment at several points simultaneously so the flames would spread evenly. Aurelia Tertia experienced this process on an afternoon in approximately 115 of the Common Era, during the reign of Trajan. The administrative records that survive from this period, fragments preserved in later compilations, describe her case in clinical terms. Aurelia Tertia, freedwoman, convicted of beneficium against Claudia Marcella, wife of Gaius Petronius Arbiter, sentenced to arena execution. Method assigned: crematio per tunicam. Execution confirmed by arena physician at the 7th hour. The record does not describe her screaming. It does not describe the smell of burning flesh that witnesses reported could reach the upper tiers of the amphitheater. It does not describe how long she remained conscious as the flames consumed her, though medical experts who have analyzed these execution methods estimate that victims remained aware for between 3 and 8 minutes, depending on how the flames spread. What the record does note is that her execution was well received by the crowd, a notation that appears frequently in arena administration documents, indicating that the death had provided satisfactory entertainment value. The philosopher Seneca, writing approximately 60 years before Aurelia's death, described the noon executions he witnessed. I happened to return home at midday, expecting rest and relaxation after the morning's entertainments. Instead, I found something quite different. The morning fights had been merciful by comparison. Now all pretense was stripped away. The men had no armor. Their bodies were completely exposed to every blow. The crowd preferred this to the regular matches, and why not? There was no helmet to deflect the sword, no shield to block the thrust. Who needs skill when you have condemned criminals killing each other? Seneca was describing the combat executions, but his observations about crowd preferences apply equally to the burning. The Romans had developed tastes for death that was visible, prolonged, and unobstructed by the protections that made gladiatorial combat survivable. The tunica molesta was used not only in arenas, but also in private spectacles hosted by emperors. Nero famously used condemned Christians as human torches to illuminate his gardens during evening parties, the burning garments providing light by which guests could dine and socialize. Tacitus describes one such evening. To suppress this rumor, Nero fabricated scapegoats and punished with every refinement the notoriously depraved Christians. Their deaths were made farcical. Dressed in wild animals' skins, they were torn to pieces by dogs, or crucified, or made into torches to be ignited after dark as substitutes for daylight. Nero provided his gardens for the spectacle, and exhibited displays in the circus, mixing with the crowd or mounted on a chariot, dressed as a charioteer. The Christians dying as human torches were experiencing the same method applied to Aurelia Tertia, the slow combustion of the pitch-soaked garment, the prolonged consciousness, the theatrical presentation of suffering as entertainment. Modern burn specialists, who have analyzed Roman execution methods, estimate that approximately 70% of tunica molesta victims died from shock and fluid loss, rather than direct flame damage, their bodies shutting down from the trauma before the fire could complete its work. The remaining 30% died from asphyxiation as the flames consumed the oxygen around their faces, or from organ failure as their core temperature rose beyond survivable levels. None of these deaths were quick. All of them were public, and all of them were considered appropriate entertainment for Roman citizens spending an afternoon at the games. The Condemnation to Beasts was Rome's most famous arena execution, but what most people imagine when they hear this phrase is drastically simpler than the reality. The popular image is of prisoners being thrown to lions, dying quickly in the jaws of predators. The actual practice was far more elaborate, involving multiple animal species, staged scenarios, and timing designed to extend death over significant periods. A man named Publius Aelius Fortunatus experienced this elaboration in approximately 177 of the Common Era, during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. He was 31 years old, a merchant convicted of fraud and theft against the imperial treasury crimes that merited public execution rather than simple imprisonment. The administrative records describe his sentence: Publius Aelius Fortunatus, citizen, convicted of peculatus and furtum against the fiscus, sentenced to damnatio ad bestias in the Flavian amphitheater. Animals assigned: bears, 3, leopards, 2, wild dogs, pack of 12. Staging: bound to stake with extended exposure intervals. The phrase, extended exposure intervals, reveals the essential cruelty of the method. Fortunatus was not thrown to animals and killed immediately. He was bound to a stake in the center of the arena, and animals were released one species at a time, with intervals between releases that allowed the crowd to observe his injuries before the next assault began. The first release was the wild dogs, chosen because they tended to bite and tear at extremities rather than attacking vital organs. The dogs were trained to approach condemned prisoners and inflict damage without killing quickly. They targeted hands, feet, faces, areas that bled spectacularly, but did not cause immediate death. After approximately 15 minutes, the dogs were recalled, and Fortunatus was left bleeding and exposed, while attendants repositioned the staging for the next phase. The crowd used this interval to comment on his injuries, to place bets on how long he would survive, to eat and drink and socialize. The leopards came next. Unlike the dogs, leopards typically attacked with killing intent, but a prisoner already weakened by blood loss and shock was less able to trigger the predatory response that led to quick killing bites. The leopards circled, struck, withdrew, struck again. The attacks continued for approximately 20 minutes before the leopards were recalled. The bears were saved for the final phase. By the time they were released, Fortunatus had been in the arena for over an hour, had lost significant blood, and was barely conscious. The bears' attacks were the most violent, but also the most merciful. Their massive size and strength meant they were capable of killing even weakened prey relatively quickly. Fortunatus died approximately 90 minutes after entering the arena. His death was recorded as satisfactory in the administrative records, meaning the crowd had been entertained, the execution had proceeded according to schedule, and no disruptions had occurred. The physician Galen, who witnessed numerous arena executions during his time in Rome, described the medical realities. The beasts do not kill cleanly as soldiers do. They tear and rend without purpose, damaging flesh in ways that cause maximum bleeding without immediately fatal injury. I have seen men survive the first assault, and the second, and sometimes the third, their bodies accumulating injuries that would each be survivable alone, but which together exceed what the human frame can endure. The death comes from exhaustion as much as from any single wound. The body simply ceases to function under the accumulated damage. Different animal species were assigned to different categories of criminals. Lions were typically reserved for the most serious offenses. treason, parricide, crimes that offended Roman sensibilities at the deepest level. Bears and leopards were assigned to serious but less symbolic crimes. Dogs and wild boars were used for lesser offenses, or for prisoners who were being executed in groups. The staging was equally variable. Some prisoners were bound to stakes, as Fortunatus was. Some were placed on elevated platforms that animals had to climb to reach. Some were given ineffective weapons, wooden swords, broken spears that provided the illusion of combat while ensuring the prisoner could not actually defend themselves. Some were dressed in costumes that made them represent mythological figures or enemies of Rome. The numbers were staggering. During the inaugural games of the Colosseum in 80 of the Common Era, approximately 9,000 animals were killed over 100 days of entertainment. Many of these animals were killed by professional hunters in mourning spectacles, but a significant portion were used in executions that could consume dozens of animals per condemned prisoner, depending on how elaborate the staging was designed to be. The noon executions occupied a specific slot in the arena schedule after the morning animal hunts, before the afternoon gladiatorial matches. This was considered the least prestigious time period, when many spectators left to eat lunch and only the most dedicated remained to watch. But those who remained saw something different from the main events. They saw condemned prisoners forced to kill each other with no armor, no training, and no possibility of survival. A woman named Licinia Sabina was scheduled for the noon executions in approximately 143 of the Common Era. She was 26 years old, a slave convicted of murdering her owner during an attempted escape. The penalty for slaves who killed their masters was death, but not simple death, exemplary death. Death that would remind other slaves of the consequences of resistance. The ludi meridiani followed a simple format. Condemned prisoners were paired against each other. Both were given weapons, usually swords, sometimes spears or clubs, but neither was given armor, shields, or any protective equipment. They were required to fight until one of them was dead. The survivor was then immediately paired against another condemned prisoner, fighting again until death occurred. The process continued until all scheduled prisoners had been killed. The administrative record for Licinia Sabina's execution reads, Licinia Sabina, slave of Marcus Aurelius Cotta, convicted of homicidium of her master, sentenced to ludi meridiani, paired first against Gaius Vedius, convicted of latrocinium, whom she killed after 4 minutes of combat, paired second against Sextus Pomponius, convicted of peculatus, by whom she was killed after 7 minutes of combat, body confirmed by arena physician, disposal standard. The dry administrative language conceals what actually happened. Licinia was forced to kill another human being, a man she did not know, who had committed property crimes unrelated to violence, using a sword she had never been trained to use. After killing him, while still covered in his blood, while still processing the trauma of having ended a human life, she was immediately confronted by another condemned prisoner who killed her in turn. Seneca's description of these noon executions remains the most vivid ancient account. In the morning, men are thrown to lions and bears. At noon, they are thrown to the spectators themselves. The crowd demands that the slayer be thrown to those who in turn will slay him, and they detain the victor for another slaughter. The outcome for the combatants is always death. Fire and sword are used to drive the combatants together. This goes on while the arena is empty of spectators. But one of them was a highway robber. He killed a man. What of it? Because he killed, he deserved this punishment. But what have you done, poor wretch, that you should deserve to watch it? The phrase, fire and sword are used to drive the combatants together, reveals a crucial detail. Condemned prisoners who refused to fight, who tried to surrender, who tried to run, who simply stood passively, were forced into combat by arena attendants, armed with hot irons and whips. There was no escape through passivity. The only escape was death, and death could only come through combat. The psychological dimension of this execution method was as deliberate as the physical. The condemned were forced to become killers before they became victims. They were forced to participate in their own dehumanization, to shed blood with their own hands before their own blood was shed. The arena transformed them from condemned criminals into executioners, then back into condemned criminals, in a cycle that continued until everyone scheduled for the noon slot was dead. Modern psychologists who have analyzed the ludi meridiani recognize it as a form of what is now called participation in atrocity, forcing victims to become perpetrators as a method of psychological destruction that compounds physical death with moral contamination. The numbers for noon executions are less well documented than other arena activities, because the Romans themselves considered this time period less important. But estimates based on arena schedules suggest that a typical day of games might execute between 10 and 30 prisoners during the noon period alone. Across the empire, across centuries, the total may have reached hundreds of thousands of people forced to kill each other for the entertainment of those who watched. The Romans called them ludi fatales, or fatal charades, theatrical productions in which condemned prisoners were forced to act out scenes from mythology, with the crucial difference that the deaths portrayed were real. A man named Marcus Ulpius Stephanus experienced this form of execution in approximately 98 of the Common Era during the reign of Nerva. He was 28 years old, a freedman convicted of theft from a temple, a crime classified as sacrilege that merited particularly elaborate punishment. The myth assigned to him was the story of Orpheus, the legendary musician who descended to the underworld to rescue his wife and was later torn apart by Maenads, the frenzied female followers of Dionysus. The staging was elaborate. A backdrop had been constructed to represent a forest scene. Musicians played instruments that evoked the legendary music of Orpheus. Stephanus was dressed in a costume that identified him as the mythological figure, a lyre strapped to his back, a laurel crown on his head, robes that made him look like a poet from legend. The animals that would represent the Maenads were not released immediately. First, Stephanus was required to perform to pretend to play the lyre, to enact scenes from the Orpheus legend, to provide the theatrical prelude that the crowd expected before the fatal conclusion. Only after the theatrical portion was complete did the arena attendants release the bear that had been trained to attack human figures. The poet Martial, who witnessed numerous mythological executions during his time in Rome, describes several in his epigrams. What before was performed in myth is now performed in the arena. Pasiphae really did mate with the Dictaean bull, believe it. We have seen it. Antiquity should not be incredulous any longer. The arena makes real whatever fame has sung. Laureolus, hanging on no pretend cross, gave up his vitals to a Caledonian bear. His lacerated limbs lived on, dripping gore, and in all his body there was no body left. The reference to Laureolus describes another mythological execution, this one reenacting the death of a legendary bandit who was crucified and then torn apart by wild animals. The condemned prisoner was actually crucified on a cross constructed for the arena, and then actually torn apart by a bear while still alive on the cross. The Pasiphae reference describes what was considered the most disturbing of the mythological executions, the reenactment of the myth in which Queen Pasiphae mated with a bull and conceived the Minotaur. In the arena version, condemned women were placed in wooden devices designed to facilitate actual coupling with bulls. Whether the women survived this assault varied. The purpose was the spectacle rather than the specific outcome. A woman named Volumnia Cytheris was subjected to this execution in approximately 112 of the Common Era. She was 34 years old, convicted of adultery, with a senator in a case that had political dimensions beyond the personal. The Pasiphae execution was assigned specifically because the adultery charge made the sexual nature of the death seem fitting to Roman sensibilities. The administrative record notes. Volumnia Cytheris, freedwoman, convicted of adulterium with Senator Gnaeus Cornelius Pulcher, sentenced to mythological execution as Pasiphae. Device constructed according to specifications. Bull provided by the imperial stables. Execution completed at the 4th hour. Body disposed according to standard procedures. The record does not note whether she survived the assault by the bull, whether she died during the process, or afterward, or how long the spectacle lasted. These details were apparently not considered worthy of administrative documentation. Modern historians estimate that mythological executions represented approximately 15 to 20% of arena deaths during the imperial period. The theatrical nature made them expensive to stage, requiring props, costumes, trained animals, and careful choreography, which meant they were typically reserved for major games rather than routine entertainment. But during major festivals, multiple mythological executions might be staged in a single day, each depicting a different fatal myth, each killing a real person in a role they had not chosen. The myths selected for arena execution were always those involving violent death: Icarus falling from the sky, prisoners thrown from heights, Hercules burning on his funeral pyre, prisoners burned alive in staged funeral scenes, Prometheus devoured by eagles, prisoners tied to rocks while trained birds attacked them, Attis castrating himself, prisoners forced to undergo emasculation before death. Each of these deaths happened to real people. Each was considered appropriate entertainment for Roman audiences. Each was documented in administrative records that noted completion times and crowd reception, but rarely mentioned the suffering of the condemned. The burning at the stake was distinct from the tunica molesta in method and duration. Where the burning garment killed through fire, spreading across the body, the crematio killed through sustained exposure to flames that approached the body from below. A man named Lucius Varius Ambustus experienced this execution in approximately 203 of the Common Era during the reign of Septimius Severus. He was 41 years old, a Roman citizen convicted of arson that had killed multiple people, a crime that Roman law considered particularly appropriate for death by fire. The staging for crematio was standardized by the imperial period. The condemned was bound to a wooden stake set in the center of the arena floor. Combustible materials, wood, straw, dried brush, were piled around the base of the stake, reaching approximately to waist height. The materials were ignited, and the condemned died as the flames rose to consume first their lower body, then their torso, then finally their head and face. The duration of this death was longer than the tunica molesta estimates, based on witness accounts suggest, between 20 and 45 minutes from ignition to death, depending on how the materials were arranged and how quickly the flames spread. The administrative record for Lucius Varius Ambustus reads, Lucius Varius Ambustus, citizen, convicted of incendium with homicidium, sentenced to crematio in the Flavian amphitheater. Execution commenced at the 6th hour. Death confirmed at the 7th hour -1/4. Crowd reception positive. Body disposed by fire completion. The notation death confirmed at the 7th hour -1/4 indicates that Ambustus took approximately 45 minutes to die from the time the flames were ignited. For 45 minutes, he burned in the center of the Colosseum while crowds watched. Witness accounts from various periods describe what this death looked like. The flames rise slowly at first, licking at the legs while the condemned screams and struggles against bonds that cannot be broken. The skin blackens and splits. The fat beneath the skin melts and feeds the fire, making the flames burn brighter. The screaming continues until the smoke grows thick enough to choke, or until the flames reach high enough to sear the throat and lungs. Some die from the smoke, some die from the fire. All die slowly, and all die in full view of those who have paid to watch. Medical experts who have analyzed death by burning estimate that consciousness is typically maintained until the flames reach the chest and begin affecting respiration. This means that victims of crematio were likely aware and suffering for between 15 and 30 minutes before losing consciousness, a duration that the Roman crowds apparently found appropriately entertaining. The crematio was used for specific categories of crimes: arson, as in Ambustus's case, certain forms of treason, some religious offenses, and occasionally for criminals whose other offenses were considered less serious, but who were being used to fill out a schedule of entertainment. During periods of Christian persecution, crematio was a common method for executing believers who refused to sacrifice to Roman gods. The numbers are difficult to estimate, because crematio was often combined with other execution methods in a single day of games. But records from provincial amphitheaters suggest that burning executions might constitute between 5 and 15% of total arena deaths, with higher percentages during periods of religious persecution, when Christians and other minority groups were being executed in large numbers. The elephant execution was considered a mark of particular imperial displeasure, reserved for criminals whose offenses had personally insulted the emperor, or whose deaths the emperor wished to witness personally. A woman named Flavia Domitilla experienced this execution in approximately 95 of the Common Era during the reign of Domitian. She was approximately 30 years old, a member of the imperial family itself, niece of the Emperor Vespasian, and first cousin of Domitian. Her crime was conversion to Judaism or Christianity. The sources are unclear which Domitian interpreted as a personal betrayal of the family and the state religion. The elephant execution worked through crushing. The condemned was placed on the arena floor, either bound and immobile or chained in a way that allowed limited movement. A trained elephant was then directed to step on the condemned person, crushing them under its weight. The cruelty of this method lay in its variability. Elephants could be trained to crush quickly a single step on the chest or head that ended life within seconds. Or they could be trained to crush slowly, stepping on limbs first, then the pelvis, then the lower torso, working upward toward vital organs over a period of minutes, while the condemned remained conscious and screaming. The administrative record for high-status executions like Flavia Domitilla's was often suppressed for political reasons. Later, emperors did not want documentation of imperial family members being executed by their predecessors. But later, historical accounts describe her death in terms that suggest the slow variant was employed. The emperor's cousin was brought to the sand in chains and placed before the elephant that Domitian himself had selected for the task. The beast was directed to begin with her feet, then her legs, then her hips. She lived through all of this, screaming for mercy that was not granted. Only when the elephant was directed to her chest did the screaming stop. Domitian watched the entire process from the imperial box, his face showing satisfaction at the death of one he considered a traitor to his house. The duration described suggests a death that lasted between 10 and 15 minutes, far longer than would have occurred if the elephant had been directed to crush vital areas immediately. Elephant executions were relatively rare because elephants were expensive to maintain and difficult to train for arena work. Records suggest that only the largest amphitheaters, Rome, Carthage, Alexandria, had elephants available for regular execution use. Provincial games might feature elephant executions only during special imperial visits or extraordinary festivals. But the symbolic power of the elephant execution made it memorable in ways that more common methods were not. To be killed by an elephant was to be killed by the emperor's personal instrument, a demonstration of imperial power that extended even to the method of death. The naumachia, the staged naval battle, is often remembered as a spectacular entertainment rather than an execution method. But for the condemned prisoners who crewed the ships, it was simply another way to die in the arena. A man named Gaius Sergius Bassus experienced this execution in approximately 52 of the Common Era during the reign of Claudius. He was 33 years old, a sailor convicted of mutiny against his captain, a crime that Roman military law punished with death. His execution was scheduled for one of the major naumachia, staged on the artificial lake that Claudius had constructed specifically for naval entertainments. The naumachia featured ships crewed entirely by condemned prisoners. These prisoners were given basic weapons, swords, spears, sometimes bows, and instructed to fight the crews of opposing ships. The battle continued until one side was entirely killed or drowned. Survivors from the winning side were typically executed afterward, either immediately in the water or later in traditional arena methods. The scale of these events was enormous. The naumachia, staged by Claudius in 52, featured approximately 19,000 condemned prisoners divided between two fleets. By the end of the day, the majority of these prisoners were dead killed in combat, drowned when their ships sank, or executed after surviving the battle. The administrative record for Gaius Sergius Bassus reads, Gaius Sergius Bassus, sailor, convicted of seditio navalis, assigned to Claudian naumachia, fleet of the Rhodians. Ship sank at the 4th hour. Body not recovered. Death presumed. The notation, body not recovered, was common in naumachia records. The artificial lakes used for these spectacles were not designed for body recovery, and drowning victims often sank beneath water that was deliberately muddied to prevent spectators from seeing too clearly what happened beneath the surface. Tacitus describes the Claudian naumachia in his Annals. A naval battle was exhibited on a lake near Rome, the opposing fleets being manned entirely by condemned criminals. The combatants were distributed between two fleets, styled after the Sicilians and Rhodians. The lake was surrounded by rafts to prevent escape. The men were armed with weapons of war that could inflict real wounds. Many perished by fighting, more by drowning. Claudius watched from a platform, dressed in a magnificent military cloak. The phrase, "many perished by fighting, more by drowning," reveals that the naval execution was as much about drowning as about combat. Ships were designed to be sinkable, and condemned prisoners who could not swim, the majority of the population in the ancient world, drowned when their vessels went under. Modern estimates suggest that mortality rates in naumachii approached 90%, far higher than in ordinary gladiatorial combat, where trained fighters had perhaps a 1 in 10 chance of dying in any given match. The naumachia was essentially mass execution disguised as entertainment, killing thousands of people in a single afternoon while spectators watched from shore. The burial in sand was a method used specifically in amphitheaters located in desert or semi-arid regions, where sand was abundant and the heat intensified the suffering of the condemned. A woman named Septimia Zosime experienced this execution in approximately 237 of the Common Era in the amphitheater at Thysdrus in Roman Africa, modern-day El Jem, Tunisia. She was 29 years old, a slave convicted of theft from her master, a crime that merited death under Roman law but was considered insufficiently serious for the more elaborate execution methods. The sand burial was simple in concept, but prolonged in execution. The condemned was buried in the arena sand up to the neck, with only the head exposed. They were then left in the sun while the games continued around them. Death came from dehydration, heat exhaustion, or animal attack, whichever arrived first. The administrative record for Septimia Zosime reads, Septimia Zosime, slave of Gaius Marius Africanus, convicted of furtum, sentenced to arena execution. Method, sand, burial. Burial completed at the 2nd hour. Death confirmed at the 9th hour. Method of death, exposure, and subsequent animal access. The notation animal access reveals that Septimia did not simply die from the heat. At some point during her 7 hours of burial, animals likely dogs or jackals trained for arena work were allowed to approach her exposed head. The end came not from the elements alone, but from teeth and claws attacking the only part of her body they could reach. Witness accounts from North African amphitheaters describe the sand burial in terms that emphasize its protracted nature. The condemned are placed in pits dug in the sand, buried to the neck, while attendants pack the sand tight around their bodies. The sun does its work slowly. The heat builds throughout the day, drawing moisture from the body, while the head bakes under direct light. Some die from the heat alone after many hours. Others are given to the animals when the afternoon grows long, and the crowd grows restless. The animals do not kill quickly when only the head is accessible. They bite and tear at faces, at ears, at scalps, while the buried body cannot defend or flee. Medical experts who have analyzed death by exposure and dehydration estimate that victims of sand burial likely remained conscious for between 4 and 8 hours in North African summer conditions, a duration that transformed a single execution into an all-day spectacle that could entertain crowds through multiple other events. The sand burial was primarily a provincial method, rarely used in Rome itself, where the climate was less extreme and other methods were preferred. But in the amphitheaters of Africa, Egypt, and the eastern provinces, it was a regular feature of games, a way to execute condemned prisoners while the main events continued, their dying providing background entertainment for spectators who might glance at the buried heads between gladiatorial matches. The condemned sewn into animal hides and thrown to trained dogs was a method that combined elements of the beast execution with additional psychological and physical torment. A man named Publius Aurelius Faustus experienced this execution in approximately 161 of the Common Era, during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. He was 37 years old, a citizen convicted of multiple counts of robbery and murder, crimes serious enough to warrant elaborate execution, but not significant enough to merit the most prestigious methods. The process began with the condemned being stripped and sewn into freshly flayed animal skins, typically wolf or dog skins, chosen because the smell would trigger aggression in the trained dogs that would perform the actual killing. The sewing was done while the skins were still wet and bloody, causing them to shrink as they dried and tightening around the body in ways that restricted movement and caused increasing discomfort. The condemned, now encased in the animal hide, was released into the arena floor where trained dogs had been waiting. The dogs, responding to the smell of blood and fresh animal skin, attacked the figure that appeared to them as prey. The hide provided no protection. It was designed to attract, attack, rather than deflect it, and the condemned died as the dogs tore through the covering to reach the human flesh beneath. The administrative record for Publius Aurelius Faustus reads, Publius Aurelius Faustus, citizen, convicted of latrocinium and homicidium, multiple counts, sentenced to arena execution. Method, dog execution with hide preparation. Hide type, lupine, wolf. Dogs used. Pack of 18. Execution duration, 14 minutes. Death confirmed by arena physician. The notation 14 minutes indicates a death that was neither quick nor extremely prolonged. The dogs were efficient at tearing through the hide, but took time to inflict enough damage to kill an adult human. Later accounts describe the psychological dimension of this method. The condemned is sewn into the skin while still alive, feeling the wet hide pressed against their flesh, feeling the rough stitches that seal them inside, feeling the skin tighten as it begins to dry. They cannot see the hide covers the face as well as the body, but they can hear the dogs being brought to the arena, can hear the snarling and barking that tells them what is coming. When the dogs attack, the condemned can only feel the teeth tearing at the hide, can only wait for the moment when the teeth break through to reach their own skin. The sensory deprivation aspect being enclosed in the hide, unable to see or effectively move, added a dimension of psychological terror to the physical death. The condemned experienced their killing primarily through sound and touch, blind to the animals that were tearing them apart. This method appears to have been used primarily during the 2nd and 3rd centuries, when arena entertainments had grown increasingly elaborate and novel execution methods were prized for their ability to attract audiences. Records suggest it was used throughout the empire, but was most common in the western provinces where wolf populations made the skins readily available. The public use of the rack, the equuleus or little horse, transformed a torture device into an execution method by extending its use until the victim died from the injuries inflicted. A woman named Claudia Felicitas experienced this execution in approximately 250 of the Common Era during the persecution of Christians under the Emperor Decius. She was 32 years old, a Christian who had refused to sacrifice to Roman gods, despite multiple demands. Her public death was intended both as punishment and as warning to other Christians who might consider similar resistance. The rack in its arena form was a wooden frame designed to stretch the human body by pulling the limbs in opposite directions. The condemned was bound at wrists and ankles, and mechanisms, typically rollers turned by attendants, gradually increased the tension until joints dislocated, muscles tore, and eventually the spine or limbs separated entirely. The duration of this death depended entirely on how quickly the attendants turned the mechanisms. A quick death might take only minutes rapid, stretching that separated the spine and caused immediate fatal injury. A prolonged death might take hours gradual stretching that dislocated joints, tore muscles, and caused massive internal bleeding without immediately fatal damage. The administrative record for Claudia Felicitas suggests the prolonged variant. Claudia Felicitas, citizen, convicted of sacrilegium and refusal of required sacrifice, sentenced to rack execution in public games. Execution commenced at the 3rd hour. Death confirmed at the 8th hour. Body disposed according to regulations for religious criminals. 5 hours from commencement to death indicates a systematic, prolonged application of the rack gradual stretching that maximized both suffering and spectacle while crowds watched. The Acts of the Martyrs' Christian documents recording the deaths of believers during persecution periods describe rack executions in terms that emphasize their duration. The Blessed Felicitas was placed upon the rack and stretched while the crowd jeered. Her shoulders were first to separate, then her hips, then her knees. She prayed throughout, her voice growing weaker as the hours passed and her body was torn apart. When at last she could no longer speak, she continued to move her lips in silent prayer. She did not die until the 5th hour after her stretching began, and those who witnessed said that even in death her face showed peace rather than suffering. The Christian framing of this account emphasizes the martyr's spiritual triumph over physical suffering, but the physical details are consistent with medical understanding of what rack torture actually does to the human body: the progressive dislocation of joints, the tearing of connective tissue, the massive internal bleeding that eventually causes death through shock and blood loss. The rack execution was used primarily during persecution periods, when large numbers of religious criminals needed to be executed in ways that would deter others. It was considered appropriate for crimes against religion because it allowed extended suffering that could be interpreted as divine punishment for the victim's theological errors. The furka, the wooden fork, was a device used primarily for slaves, but occasionally employed in arena executions for dramatic effect. A man named Titus Flavius Hermeros experienced this execution in approximately 123 of the Common Era, during the reign of Hadrian. He was 25 years old, a slave convicted of striking his master during a dispute, a crime that under Roman law was punishable by death without the protections afforded to citizens. The furka was a Y-shaped wooden yoke placed around the neck, with the arms extended along the branches and bound in place. The condemned could walk while wearing the furka, but could not use their arms, could not defend themselves, and could not remove the device without assistance. In arena use, the furka served as a restraint that made the condemned helpless while various punishments were inflicted. The wearer might be beaten with rods while unable to shield themselves. They might be attacked by animals while unable to fight back. They might be burned, cut, or otherwise tortured, while the wooden frame held them in position for whatever was being done. The administrative record for Titus Flavius Hermeros reads, Titus Flavius Hermeros, slave of Marcus Petronius Mamertinus, convicted of assaulting his master, sentenced to arena execution. Method: furca with progressive punishment. Punishments administered: flogging, 200 strokes, branding, imperial marks, exposure to animals, dogs, death confirmed at the 6th hour. The phrase progressive punishment indicates that Hermeros experienced multiple forms of torture before finally dying, each form inflicted while the furca prevented any possibility of resistance or defense. Accounts of furca executions emphasize the helplessness of the condemned. The slave was fitted with a fork and led to the center of the sand. His arms were stretched along the wood, bound so tightly that his fingers turned white. The attendants approached with rods and began the beating his back, his legs, his buttocks, any part of his body they could reach while the fork held him in place. He tried to turn, to dodge, to minimize the blows, but the fork prevented any effective movement. After the beating came the brand's iron marks pressed to his flesh while he screamed. After the brands came the dogs. Throughout all of this, the fork held him upright and exposed, unable to shield any part of his body from what was being done. The furca execution could last anywhere from 30 minutes to several hours, depending on how many punishment stages were included and how severe each stage was. It was considered appropriate for slaves because it emphasized their status as property without rights. The fork was, itself, a slave's device, used to restrain and transport unfree persons, and its use in execution underscored that the condemned died as a slave rather than as a human being. The throwing of condemned prisoners from heights Precipitation was used both as a civil execution method and as an arena spectacle, particularly when staging the deaths of mythological figures who died by falling. A woman named Julia Priscilla experienced this execution in approximately 147 of the Common Era. She was 19 years old, convicted of poisoning multiple members of a household where she worked as a servant. The scale of her alleged crimes: 4 deaths attributed to her warranted, elaborate public execution. The arena staging for Precipitation involved the construction of elevated platforms from which the condemned would be thrown. The height varied depending on the desired effect. Higher platforms produced more spectacular falls but quicker deaths, while lower platforms might result in severe injuries that did not immediately kill, allowing for further punishment of the survivor. The mythological framing often used was the death of Icarus, the boy who flew too close to the sun and fell when his wax wings melted. The condemned would be dressed in costumes that included artificial wings, raised to the platform, and thrown while spectators watched them fall. The administrative record for Julia Priscilla reads, Julia Priscilla, servant in the household of Gaius Sempronius Atratinus, convicted of multiple counts of beneficium, sentenced to arena execution. Method: precipitation as Icarus. Platform height: 40 cubits. Fall resulted in severe injury, not immediate death. Death completed by animal exposure. Total execution duration: approximately 1 hour. The notation fall resulted in severe injury, not immediate death, indicates that Julia survived the initial fall, likely with broken bones, internal injuries, and significant pain, but remained alive on the arena floor until animals were released to finish what the fall had begun. Martial describes similar executions in terms that emphasize the theatrical nature. As Icarus fell when his wax wings failed, so the criminal falls from the platform to the sand below. But Icarus died quickly, while the criminal may survive the fall to suffer what comes after. The arena improves on the myth it provides a second death for those the fall does not kill. The combination of fall and subsequent punishment was common in precipitation executions. The fall was spectacular, visible to the entire crowd, dramatic in its sudden violence, but often not fatal. What followed, the fall varied. Sometimes animals, sometimes further torture, sometimes simply leaving the injured condemned to die slowly from their injuries while the games continued around them. Height calculations in surviving records suggest that arena platforms range from approximately 30 to 60 cubits, roughly 45 to 90 feet. Falls from the lower end of this range frequently resulted in survival with severe injuries. Falls from the higher end were more likely to be immediately fatal. The most disturbing category of arena execution involved condemned women being subjected to sexual assault as part of their public death methods that combined violation with killing in ways designed to satisfy the darkest appetites of pace. Roman crowds. A woman named Act Alexandrina experienced this execution in approximately 109 of the Common Era during the reign of Trajan. She was 24 years old, a slave convicted of theft and prostitution crimes that in combination apparently warranted execution methods that emphasized the sexual nature of her alleged offenses. The arena staging for sexual executions varied. Some involved human perpetrators, condemned male criminals, who were offered reduced sentences in exchange for assaulting female prisoners publicly. Some involved animals, the pacifi, executions described earlier, in which women were placed in devices that facilitated assault by bulls or other large animals. Some involved objects, wooden implements, used to violate women before they were killed through other methods. The administrative record for Acte Alexandrina reads, Acte Alexandrina, slave, convicted of furtum and lunacinium, sentenced to arena execution, method, pacife, staging with subsequent animal exposure, staging completed at the 4th hour, death from animal exposure confirmed at the 5th hour. The clinical language conceals what actually happened, a woman forced into a device that allowed a bull to assault her, followed by exposure to predatory animals that killed her while crowds watched. Tertullian, the Christian writer, condemned these executions in terms that suggest their frequency. We see women given not merely to death, but to defilement before death, as though their crime was insufficient punishment. They must be violated before they are killed. The arena that claims to uphold Roman virtue displays acts that would shame the most degraded barbarian, and the crowds applaud what they witness, calling for more, demanding variations that inventors of cruelty struggle to provide. The psychological dimension of these executions extended beyond the individual victim to serve as warning against specific categories of female behavior. Women convicted of sexual crimes, adultery, prostitution, sexual service to slaves, were particularly likely to receive sexually oriented executions that emphasized the nature of their alleged offenses. Modern historians who have analyzed Roman arena practices estimate that sexual executions represented approximately 5 to 10% of female arena deaths, a minority, but a significant minority, concentrated during certain periods and certain imperial administrations that particularly favored this category of spectacle. Modern archaeological and forensic research has provided physical evidence for many of these execution methods. Excavations at amphitheater sites throughout the former Roman Empire have uncovered human remains that show evidence of execution trauma. At the amphitheater in Chester, England, forensic analysis of bones revealed individuals who had been attacked by large carnivores' tooth marks, consistent with lions and bears. At Ephesus, Turkey, skeletal remains showed fracture patterns consistent with precipitation from heights. At Rome itself, excavations near the Colosseum have uncovered bone fragments with burning damage, cuts from bladed weapons, and other indicators of violent death. The scale of these findings, combined with administrative records and literary sources, allows modern historians to estimate that the Roman arena system killed between 200,000 and 400,000 people, over its 4-century history deaths that occurred in the Colosseum and in hundreds of provincial amphitheaters scattered across 3 continents. These numbers do not include gladiators who died in combat, animal handlers killed by their charges, or spectators who died in occasional structural collapses. They include only the condemned, the prisoners, criminals, prisoners of war, religious minorities, and political enemies who were executed publicly as part of the entertainment industry that the arena represented. The administrative records that survive are fragmentary but revealing. They show an execution system that was organized, bureaucratized, and optimized for entertainment value. Officials tracked which methods produced positive crowd responses. They experimented with variations and combinations. They developed specializations. Certain amphitheaters became known for certain types of execution, drawing crowds who traveled specifically to see those methods employed. Medical literature from the period reveals that arena physicians studied the deaths they witnessed, developing understanding of human anatomy and mortality that informed both medical practice and execution technique. The physician Galen, who served as a gladiator doctor early in his career, wrote detailed accounts of wound patterns and death mechanisms that show careful observation of arena violence. This was not chaos. This was not random cruelty. This was an industry organized, profitable, and central to Roman social and political life for 400 years. For Aurelia Tertia, who was 23 years old and wore the burning garment for 15 minutes while crowds watched her die. For Publius Aelius Fortunatus, who was 31 years old and spent 90 minutes being torn apart by animals released in stages specifically to prolong his suffering. For Licinia Sabina, who was 26 years old and was forced to kill another human being before being killed herself in the noon executions. For Marcus Ulpius Stephanus, who was 28 years old and died as Orpheus, torn apart by a bear in a mythological execution he had not chosen. For Lucius Varius Ambustus, who was 41 years old and burned at the stake for 45 minutes while 50,000 people watched. For Flavia Domitilla, who was approximately 30 years old and was crushed slowly by an elephant on the orders of her own cousin, the emperor. For Gaius Sergius Bassus, who was 33 years old and drowned in a staged naval battle with 18,000 other condemned prisoners. For Septimia Zosime, who was 29 years old and spent 7 hours buried in sand before being given to the animals. For Publius Aurelius Faustus, who was 37 years old and was sewn into a wolfskin before being torn apart by dogs who could not see that he was human. For Claudia Felicitas, who was 32 years old and spent 5 hours on the rack because she would not renounce her faith. For Titus Flavius Hermeros, who was 25 years old and died in the Furca because he struck a man who owned him. For Julia Priscilla, who was 19 years old and survived a fall of 40 cubits, only to be killed by animals on the arena floor. For Acte Alexandrina, who was 24 years old and experienced violations that Roman law considered appropriate entertainment. For the hundreds of thousands of others whose names were not recorded, whose administrative files were lost, whose deaths were witnessed by crowds, and then forgotten. For the Christians and Jews and followers of foreign gods, who died because their beliefs offended Roman sensibilities. For the prisoners of war who died because their nations resisted Roman expansion. For the slaves who died because Roman law did not consider them fully human. For the citizens who died because they committed crimes or offended the powerful, or simply were in the wrong place when the arena needed bodies. They died for entertainment. They died because the Roman system considered their deaths appropriate spectacle for afternoon crowds. They died because an empire that built roads and aqueducts and libraries also built an industry of human destruction that operated for 4 centuries across 3 continents. They died because power unchecked by accountability will always find ways to transform suffering into entertainment, because cruelty given institutional form becomes normalized, because audiences who witness atrocity regularly will eventually find it ordinary. This is what the Roman arena actually was. Not gladiators fighting for honor. Not dramatic thumbs up and thumbs down. An execution industry that killed hundreds of thousands of people using methods designed to maximize suffering and spectacle. A system that transformed human beings into entertainment products. Their deaths rated for crowd reception. Their suffering optimized for viewing satisfaction. A civilization that built the Pantheon and the Colosseum, that produced Virgil and Marcus Aurelius, that gave us law and engineering and philosophy, and that also produced an industrial system for torturing people to death while crowds ate lunch and placed bets. Remember this when you see the ruins. Remember that the stones were stained with blood. Remember that the crowds cheered. Remember that the Empire called this civilization. Subscribe if you want more hidden histories revealed. Comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from. Share this video with anyone who thinks they know about Roman gladiators, but has only seen the Hollywood version. The arena was not a sports venue. It was an execution chamber that seated 50,000. And the executions were the entertainment.